let's say there's 8 billion monetary units, right? And 8 billion is not too hard for your mind to understand. Once you get to trillions, your brain just breaks, right? And so 400 trillion is a lot of money, right? It's just, your mind can't comprehend that. But 8 billion people, 8 billion monetary units. Of those monetary units in the world, you have 2 of them. I have 1 of them, Danny has half of 1. If magically the next day there's 16 billion monetary units, did wealth go up in the world? Same, just a different measurement. Abundance and money creates scarcity everywhere else. So what ends up happening is, but you think it did because you're 4, you're 2. If it didn't go to 4, then you got your pocket picked. What ends up happening is the rich get more of that, because the rich have more of the assets that don't move, right? More of the stocks that take that value. And the poor, inflation is wage deflation, right? So the poor, if you don't have access to all of the stocks, land, everything else, the things that are holding value better than others, they're all losing value, right? But some are holding value better than others. In 1920, it was 1923 that Keynes wrote Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren. Whenever that was, that he predicted, and this is where he got this thing totally wrong. He predicted the trend properly about where technology was going, but he didn't predict what human nature would do to money. So he predicted the global average working week would be 10 hours a week in 2020. What's happened? And so what would happen if you let prices fall? People would have more than they have today without the time and the jobs. It's just such a paradigm shift. It's so hard to believe because you can't prove that, right? You have to infer it from what the trend would do because we haven't lived in that world. But what does the world look like? Some people, because they're sitting on top of rent seeking, from that they're not productive. It's not being productive form of value for other people. They're sitting on top of that system that they're getting wealth gain at the expense of other people in the world. So some people are working 80 hours, 100 hours, trying to keep up, and it's getting harder and harder and harder. Used to be, if you were in the 1%, it was really great. Now you need to be in the 0.1% to be really great. And that paradigm flip is so hard to fathom because we don't live in it. So would some people understand the benefits and turn a blind eye? Absolutely. The majority, it's a system reinforcing and people telling themselves that they have to keep this going because if they don't keep it going, the world collapses. And actually, you could easily tell yourself, if you're Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, and your base is telling you how much they love you because you're attacking big interests, and you're going to redistribute that. Their whole feedback mechanism, they will disconfirm evidence that what we're talking about, because their feedback mechanism from their base that is hurt the worst tells them how great they are, right? And for them to unwind their belief system to face the truth means that a lot of the people that they say they're helping, they're hurting the most. And it's ludicrous if somebody said to you, 2 things. If somebody said, hey, I have a calculator app, it's going to cost $30 a month, you'd laugh them out of your house. It would be ludicrous. On the other side, if somebody came to me as far as an investor in the ecosystem and said, I have this great idea for a calculator app, I wouldn't take the call. So we can see it happening. We can see it happening all around us. And it's because what ends up happening is when there is money in the economic incentive and a market that allows you to rewrite the rules to create more value for people, the market moves there no matter what, and it attacks those margins until they're free. I don't think over the long enough time horizon, there's any exceptions to that rule. Now, today, if you're measuring in a world where the measurement itself is all on manipulated money, then people want to matter so much, they want to look good to society so much that they'll pay almost anything to stand out from the crowd. There's always been two doors. Hard default, $400 trillion of hard default, and all of this monetary units and all the black pools of money, everything collapsing. That day would look like this. 3 days later, you'd walk to your grocery store, which would be closed. You'd try to get food off the shelf, would be closed. It would be complete chaos everywhere. And if you look at countries that go through that, it looks dystopian, right? So that would come immediately. It's just too hard to believe. And so it's easier just to say, I'm doing the best I can in the system, right? And be a cog in that wheel. And that whole system gets more and more unstable, and other things start to happen. That's actually why, if you like that Greatest Game article I wrote, it was written in November of 2020. You could look at it right now and see exactly where we are in the system change, right? You could see exactly what step by step has to happen in the existing system. I talked about proxy wars coming, right? And what had to happen. I talked about CBDCs long before CBDCs or kind of people are talking about it. And that's just starting, right? I talked about what eventually the banks will be, why the banks will move to Bitcoin, because they have to, right? Because otherwise their power is going to be taken away through the government, because if you have a direct distribution, then you can. So all of these things, if you just look at that article, you can see exactly where we are in this transition from systems. And that's why I don't give the existing system a lot of energy when all of these things that I know are going to happen and all the next things that I know are going to happen, okay, it's just noise. Not themselves as a cog in that system, and what that would look like. That would look like you go back to the Stone Ages and you're bartering for everything. And Bitcoin would do really well in that environment because it would be the only thing that would kind of retain value. But there's a whole bunch of unintended consequences that it would be ugly. It'd be really ugly if that was, and you can see what that looks like for countries that don't have their currency, right? Don't have their reserve currency, because it looks like that, right? And it looks like that. How do they get out of it? Now, why that has implications for Bitcoin and why this is going to take a long time to play out is if those people knew, Venezuela, Lebanon, Turkey, then you would think that Bitcoin would have 100% penetration there, but it doesn't. It probably doesn't have 5% penetration, right? So why at 100% inflation do people not change? And that's a clue for you wouldn't change either, or you would, I would. But most people, what Luke's talking about is they get the rug pull. And what would that look like in Venezuela, say, for example? Comparatively to the rest of the world, they just got their currency devalued. Because that deflation would mean, and that's where people conflate the difference about deflation, that debt deflation, the debt in the world is already insolvent. So we live in a world, effectively a make-believe world, where that debt is already insolvent and we pretend it's solvent, right? Everybody, we pretend it's solvent. You live in a system where the entire system is insolvent and you're supposed to try to remain solvent. So you're playing by different rules than the system plays. And at the top of that system, if you're too big to fail, you get bailed out by the taxpayer over and over and over again. So what ends up happening is everybody races to try to be too big to fail. It creates this very incentive that to make essentially theft a base layer in the economy. And what would the mirror reflection of society look like if you had theft as a base layer of every trade, right? Because that's what it looks like. Who would win in that environment? And theft is a harsh word, right? And so people don't, oh, no, it's not theft. Well, tell me what it is. Like actually, so if it's not theft, you don't vote for it. You don't vote for inflation. You don't have a say that more monetary units are created. And so human intelligence is literally error correction. and a global kind of driving that. And what that effectively what that means is, or a different way to look at that is, all we are on an evolutionary scale is one rung in a ladder searching for, we're limited energy. We ourselves are limited energy, limited storage, and limited compute. And we're connected through trust and division of labor to do certain things, micro things, better than others. And we trade our time for somebody else's time that does that other thing better, right? And so we create a supercomputer of us. All of those limited energy, limited storage, and limited brains compute. We create a supercomputer, almost an unlimited supercomputer that we actually project. We think about what the world could look like. And we're constantly doing that all together to try to make that world better. So a friend of mine who climbs mountains for kind of hospitals and kids with cancer, he was flying into McKinley, and as he's flying in, I think they had to land kind of an uphill ice slope or something like that. It might have been. I might be getting it wrong. It might have been Nepal, but it was either McKinley. It's scary either way. And they're flying in, and he sees this plane rolled over, and he's talking to the pilot and everything else as they're flying in. And he says, "I guess that airline's out of business." And the pilot goes, "No, that's this airline." And he goes, "Everyone died and everything else in this airline." And Russ looks at him, and the guy goes, "People forget." But again, what you're talking about, Argentina, the system has so much power over them, and they're measuring the system by the system, and they just, okay. People forget. What Luke's talking about is when Israel would quickly devalue their currency, and then everything's good again, people forget. Right? And each wave of that is going to create more Bitcoiners. And each wave of that is going to kind of harden Bitcoin more and more. And at some point, there's this transition. And one of those rules is prices fall to the marginal cost of production, right? If you start there, and nobody has ever challenged me on that. Some people say, well, not if you regulate an industry. With prices, period, exclamation mark, prices fall to the marginal cost of production, right? Over a long enough time horizon. You can regulate an industry to stop it, right? And then that technology keeps moving, and it moves outside of your area that you've regulated to a different domain that hasn't regulated. And then that attacks the incumbent or the regulated industry. But over a long enough time horizon, prices fall to the marginal cost of production. You're measuring the world differently. You're measuring the world in something that can't be manipulated. You're measuring the accurate, if prices fall to the marginal cost of production over time, and the marginal cost of production is falling exponentially because of technology and it's everywhere, then the only way you could measure that is through a fixed monetary unit that couldn't be manipulated. It has to accelerate. Yeah. So remember in my book that I said, I even talked about this debt that had grown. You had $185 trillion of new debt in the preceding 20 years for $46 trillion of global economic growth. So it was essentially a 4-to-1 debt for growth, right? If you ran your personal finances like that, and it had to grow 4-to-1 for every product, you'd kind of be screwed. It's the same thing here. And it has to, and because technology is driving one way faster and faster and faster, the debt has to grow. The manipulation of money now, because the debt's already insolvent, has to grow at an offsetting pace. It's just an exponential pattern that is a mirror image of the other exponential pattern. When you aggregate all of a system that's 10,000 times bigger than Bitcoin, that everyone operates in and tries to makes stronger and stronger. Every time they're yelling at that system, every time they're marching on the streets and breaking windows, every time they go to war against another country, they're strengthening that system. They're giving more power to that system. But they're literally making that system. But again, because think about those wars and think about the broken windows and think about where does the money come to replace it? And the way the world works today, they have higher labor rates, and it's all based on debt. They're the only purchaser of the world. So if you got all the BRICS countries together, and there's nobody to buy the stuff, and all most of their drivers are raw materials to purchase things to be able to sell to the U.S., and there's no buyer, the whole thing doesn't work. And so so why people get caught in that, they're anchored to a system, and all the history books, everything else always looked like this system. Restarting wars, reset the currency, winner of the war, resets the rules, starts again. And most of those, and if you'd never seen something that could be decentralized and secure, right, that didn't have to have that, right, then you have a base layer that doesn't need an institution for its kind of reserve, right? You have a bearer instrument asset in the base layer that nobody can change the rules, right? That's through history, we've never had that. So it would be an invention or be a discovery that would change forward, and all of the other models looking backwards would have some sort of distortion in them. Now, if you, on layer 2, added velocity, unlimited velocity to that money, because it acts as a network instead of gold, and you didn't have to replace a debt-based system on top of this because you had unlimited velocity with a bearer instrument in it, then the debt that was needed to be able to drive those economies isn't needed to be able to drive the future economies. And that network growing and growing and growing is what we're talking about. Repricing all of the existing system is going to be repriced into that network. I recognized this before I saw Bitcoin. Bitcoin became, for me, and I think I told you this before, I was a holder of Bitcoin, but a small holder, and almost test trying to see what it was. But I actually hadn't done the work to be able to defend, could this win against what was coming? Could this remain decentralized, secure? When you aggregate all of a system that's 10,000 times bigger than Bitcoin, that everyone operates in and tries to makes stronger and stronger. Every time they're yelling at that system, every time they're marching on the streets and breaking windows, every time they go to war against another country, they're strengthening that system. So yes, will people with money pay more for certain things or more for value? What they're actually doing, no matter what that economic calculation is, in their head, they're saying, this has value to me. So play this on a long enough time horizon, even on a car or food. So what are the inputs for that? And once all of the inputs are essentially robotics and AI merging to be able to drive cost way down, can that value keep climbing, right? Because if it kept climbing unnaturally, because it's climbing today, because you're making up more monetary units to make it climb, right? Abundance and money equals scarcity everywhere else. That's the paradigm we live in today. Then it'll keep rising in those terms. But what's actually happening, and what's actually happening on Bitcoin, because it's outside of that system, is its pricing, it's actually not going up. It's staying stable. Yes, it's going up in fiat terms, but it's a better way to look at it, that everything in price forever will fall against Bitcoin. Who are you going to let lose? The debt's insolvent, and so if people have leveraged up that debt that's already insolvent, and you make the money cheaper, they pay back the debt in cheaper terms. But if they lever at the wrong time, and you have deflation, then they get wiped out too. Right. So you're playing a really scary game at this kind of end of days it's not end of days on a financial system, but lots of events could happen to flip it one way. And if you don't have enough time in that, if you're all in on a system and that it doesn't go your way, you're wiped out.